This channel is part of the History Hit network.
During the course of one summer afternoon, the fate of the Royalist cause in the north of England was decided by the twists of fate here at the field of Marston Moor.
There is no clear answer to what caused the English Civil War. Contemporaries and later historians have disagreed greatly about the causation. The fashion now is to emphasise short-term causes, and mainly political and religious. Things like the policies of Charles I, his fiscal policies, his religious policies. Indeed, historians nowadays would stress the religious element to causing and motivating people to fight the Civil War.
At the end of 1643, the fate of England lay poised in the balance. After over a year of bloody civil war, King Charles I and his Royalist army were clearly on the defensive. Now was the moment for the Roundheads to strike a decisive blow. But Parliament's armies were split by internal strife and ravaged by typhus.
The situation in 1643 is essentially a fairly simple one. The Royalists, or the Cavaliers if you like, and the Parliamentarians, the Roundheads, have been at each other's throat for a year and a half without a strategic victory on either side.
There had been a battle between the two sides, the Royalists and the Parliamentarians, at Edge Hill in October 1642. Effectively, this was a draw.
There was a lot of attempts to seize territory, take a town here, put a garrison there, but nothing that was particularly conclusive. And as 1643 came to an end, each side could think that they'd really made very little progress in terms of fighting the war effectively.
In the south, it was a wave of Royalist victories, coming to a stop at Cheriton. In the Midlands, it was to and fro, and here in the north, it was to and fro. The war, until Marston Moor, hung in the balance.
One thing alone could now bring victory to either side: foreign intervention.
Foreign help was important because of this difficulty of mobilising support effectively in England. There hadn't been any widespread fighting in England for about a century and a half. There was not much in the way of supply of arms in the country, and there was very little tradition of fighting or experience of fighting.
The King looks to Ireland in the hope that he's going to get Irish reinforcements to help his Cavaliers, as they're frequently called. The Roundheads, on the other hand, look to Scotland because that's their best hope of gaining some real intervention into the Civil War.
While the King's Irish reinforcements arrived piecemeal in dribs and drabs, Parliament won the wholehearted support of Scotland. That support brought with it a fresh national army, 20,000 strong. Unless this mighty army could be destroyed, the King's war was all but lost.
In recent years, there's been a stress on the British aspect of the war, a recognition that the English Civil War can't be seen in isolation, that it was part of a broader conflict that engaged the whole of Britain and Ireland, and that the English Civil War is just one aspect of a war in the three kingdoms, or alternatively, a British war.
The English Parliament wanted to gain the Scots army, which was then in Ulster. The army had been sent there in 1641 and 1642 after the outbreak of the Catholic uprising to protect Scottish settlers. But the English negotiators soon discovered that this wasn't going to be possible.
The Scots already have an army who are fighting in Ireland, but as is very typical in those days, they haven't actually been paid a penny for something like 3 years. So they're on the verge of mutiny, and they're obviously not going to provide the decisive intervention. So what Scotland does is to raise a new army, the Army of the Covenant, and it's that army which is used to decisively intervene in the Civil War in the north.
Give your fire!
History Hit is like Netflix just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. Whether you're looking to dive into life and crime in Victorian London, or the forgotten history that deserves to be heard, History Hit has a documentary for you, just a click away. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you can't find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
The infantry regiments of the Civil War period were organised in an unique way. Side by side in each regiment, there were to be found two quite different kinds of soldiers: musketeers and pikemen.
By 1644, the musket had become the supreme weapon of the English Civil Wars. Although it had become a lot lighter than its use on the continent and the rest had been discarded, it was still fairly slow to reload. Consequently, whilst the musketeers were reloading, they were prone to attack by cavalry, and to defend them from cavalry, they used the 16-foot ash steel-tipped pike.
Most armies would wish in their infantry regiments to have a majority of musketeers to pikemen, perhaps 3 to 2 or 2 to 1, though that wasn't always possible, and some Civil War regiments actually had roughly equal numbers of pikemen and musketeers.
The musketeers were armed with matchlock muskets. These were simple muzzle-loading weapons, fired by means of a piece of match or slow-burning fuse.
The muskets were really quite deadly at reasonably close range. But the great problem with them is that they took a good deal of time to reload. They took 2 to 3 minutes, and in this time the musketeer was, of course, in grave peril of attack from cavalrymen.
On the 19th of January 1644, Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven, led his blue-bonneted army across the River Tweed into the north of England. The north of England had been won for the king by the Marquis of Newcastle's victory over the northern Parliamentarians at Adwalton Moor. Since then, it had been a secure rear area for the Royalists.
These were the recruiting grounds, the great landed estates from where many of the Royalist gentry could draw support. It was also for taxation purposes, huge areas and small towns from which you could raise the sinews of war.
Freed from parliamentarian interference, this area not only provided recruits for the Royalist armies, but coal, the chief product of the region, was shipped out from the Tyne to pay for the arms and ammunition. These munitions were landed by blockade runners who slipped past the stronger parliamentarian navy. Twice so far, Newcastle had supplied convoys of imported ammunition to the king at critical moments, and without these crucial supplies, the war in the south might already have been lost. Now the Scots invasion threatened to choke off this vital supply route, and simultaneously to destroy one of the king's most important source of recruits.
If you wanted to draw a parallel, one of the best parallels you could probably draw is with World War II, just before the Normandy battles emerged with the second front in World War II. The king's a bit like the German forces. He's on the back foot, he's just managing to hold his own, but the emergence of this new army and this second front, if you like, decisively tips the balance.
All that stood in Leslie's path was the bad weather and a bare handful of untrained and poorly equipped militia units. Responding at once to the danger, the Marquess of Newcastle raced northwards in a desperate attempt to at least hold the line of the River Tyne against the invading army. William Cavendish, the Marquess of Newcastle, was a fabulously wealthy landowner who had spent an enormous portion of his own personal wealth on the King's War. He was, however, to prove a less than effective commander when the occasion really demanded. Now a fresh disaster struck. Emboldened by Newcastle's absence in the north, the Yorkshire Parliamentarians, led by Lord Fairfax and his son, Sir Thomas Fairfax, fell upon his rear. Storming the market town of Selby on the 11th of April, they destroyed the field army left by the Marquess to cover the city of York. York was the Royalist northern capital and was now in grave danger.
If the Marquess of Newcastle had not been in the far north by the River Tyne attempting to organise a defence against the Scots, and if he had therefore been available at York with his forces, it seems most unlikely that Fairfax would have succeeded in taking Selby.
All hope of halting the Scots' advance was abandoned, and Newcastle rushed southwards to save York. At this point, Alexander Leslie, the Earl of Leven, revealed his true worth as a strategist.
Rather than being distracted by long sieges further north, rather than dividing his army significantly, he kept the main body intact and he moved south at speed, brushing aside the Royalists, clearly aiming at the Royalist northern capital of York to apply as much pressure as quickly as possible on the Royalist cause in the north of England.
Leven, despite the fact that his supply lines were endangered by Royalists behind him, took the correct decision. He moved south to threaten the real base of Royalist power and to lay siege to York.
This meant that Leven was now free to join with Manchester and join with the Fairfaxes in order to besiege York. It united the three armies together. It forced the Battle of Marston Moor, and consequently that decision to come south was critical to the whole progress of the war.
By the 22nd of April, he was united with the English Parliamentarian forces led by Fairfax. They met outside York, and Newcastle's army was promptly besieged within the ancient walls. Unless relief could come soon, the Royalists would be starved into submission, at which point the North, and ultimately perhaps the fortunes of the king himself, would be ended. Royalist reserves by this stage of the war were practically non-existent. The only quarter from which aid could realistically be expected to come to the relief of York was from the King's own Oxford army. Unfortunately, just at that particular moment, the King's Oxford army had its own problems and was in no condition to assist anyone. At the end of March 1643, a Royalist thrust towards London had been heavily defeated at the Battle of Cheriton, and ever since then, the king had been forced onto the defensive, with the increasingly feeble Royalist forces entrapped around Oxford, held by far superior parliamentary forces.
If you look for a parallel, the situation of the king is very much like that of the German forces in World War II, where the Germans looked for miracle weapons to try and resolve their position. King Charles II had a miracle weapon, and it came in the form, he felt, of Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert was his most trusted and able and decisive general, and he now desperately needed to come up with a quick and imaginative solution.
So Charles ordered his nephew, Prince Rupert, to break out from Oxford and head northwards to relieve the city of York. As the situation in the south was so critical, only Prince Rupert's own regiments of infantry and cavalry could be spared from the main field army. Rupert was therefore to assemble his relief army as best he could from the scattered Royalist forces he met en route to York. The army gained strength, but even with the aid of other locally raised units, there still were not nearly enough men available to attempt a march on York. Undaunted, Rupert then hatched an ambitious plan. At the beginning of the war, much of Lancashire declared for the king. But in the spring of 1643, Parliament gained the upper hand after the Battle of Whalley Ridge. Rupert now reasoned that if he could retake Lancashire for the king, he would then be able to recruit the additional men he needed for the relief of York.
Prince Rupert started out on his way to York with 8,000 people. And he stopped off in Stockport, where he got the Lancashire Royalists to join him. And along his way to York, he made a stop in Liverpool, and he made a stop here and there. And all along the way, his charisma and the fact that he was the effective Royalist leader moving through the countryside, the fact that he was able to take parliamentary-held towns in the north, meant that people flocked to join him.
On the other hand, it is to be said that even when he arrived at York, and even with the addition of the York garrison, his forces were inferior to those on the parliamentary side.
One of the problems was that many of his troops were untrained and they were not used to fighting together. One commentator has called it a patchwork army.
Meanwhile, back in Oxford, in Rupert's absence, the war was going very badly for the king. With two parliamentarian armies led by the Earl of Essex and Sir William Waller operating against him, he was very hard-pressed indeed. In his desperation, the king decided to concentrate the Royalist forces at the loyal town of Worcester. He wrote to Rupert in an attempt to recall his forces for that rendezvous.
The disastrous thing, of course, is the communication between King Charles and Prince Rupert. Now, Charles sends him this letter, which is so ambiguous and couched in these terms that you probably need a lawyer to try and unravel.
If York be lost, I shall esteem my crown little less, unless supported by your sudden march to me, and a miraculous conquest in the south, before the effects of their northern power can be found here. But if York be relieved, and you beat the rebels' army of both kingdoms, which are before it, then, but otherwise not, I may possibly make a shift upon the defensive, to spin out time until you come to assist me. But if that be either lost, or have freed themselves from the besiegers, or that, from want of powder, you cannot undertake that work, that you immediately march with your whole strength directly to Worcester, and to assist me and my army.
Essentially what Charles is saying to Rupert, it would appear, is that he should try his best and relieve the pressure in the north, but come what may, he must appear with his forces at Worcester.
Weighing up all the options, Rupert quickly came to a decision. If he marched at once to rejoin the king, York would certainly be lost. On the other hand, the king's letter hinted that he still had a few days' grace. So, once again displaying the single-minded determination which is so typical of him, Rupert decided to chance his luck and relieve York first.
Prince Rupert knew that he only had a limited time in which to use his newly gathered large force to good effect in the north. He knew he had to get down to Worcester to rejoin the main army. He also knew that there was a parliamentary force on its way to help out Old Man Fairfax, who was running the parliamentary siege around York. So Rupert wanted to get Fairfax away from York before Fairfax was reinforced.
So, in a sense, there was no doubt that Rupert was doing the right thing, both by himself and by the king.
Setting off across the Pennines, he reached the small market town of Knaresborough on the 30th of June.
The very fact that Rupert was on his way to York with about 14,000 men actually caused the abandonment of the siege. The Parliamentarian forces gave up and endeavoured to stop him. They could not risk having one force attack them from one side and the Yorkist garrison to come out and attack them from the other. So they gave up the siege and retired up the Tadcaster Road to vaguely the Marston Moor area.
To their surprise, however, there was no sign of the Royalists that day. Instead of marching due eastwards from Knaresborough, Rupert had struck northwards. He crossed one tributary of the River Ouse at Boroughbridge and then another at Thornton Bridge, before turning south again, having completely outflanked the Allies. That night, as his weary infantry flung themselves down to rest, Rupert's cavalry pushed on to York and relieved the city to the untrammelled joy of its weary defenders.
Initially, it looked as if Rupert had succeeded brilliantly in the campaign. He'd achieved what he'd set out to do. He'd gone on a very vigorous and bold thrust up through Liverpool. He'd freed besieged towns, he'd increased the strength of his army, and he'd relieved York. So at the time of when he arrived there, it looked like it was a spectacular success for the Royalist strategy.
But the relief of York was not decisive while there was a very strong Parliamentary and Scottish army in the north of England. It was the destruction of that army that was the key to the north.
Together, the two Royalist armies now mustered a total of 6,000 cavalry and 11,000 infantry. Although he was still slightly outnumbered by the Allies, Rupert now had enough men to fight his battle on roughly equal terms. Or so he thought. The problem was that the troops in York did not share his martial enthusiasm. Having just weathered a long siege, the men of the Marquis of Newcastle's army were in no mood for a fight. And, crucially, neither was his Scottish Chief of Staff, Lord Athin. Athin's basic problem was that while he had been happy enough to fight against the English parliamentarians, he was less than happy at the prospect of fighting against his own fellow countrymen. Indeed, many of Newcastle's men were Scots, and they had already abandoned him to rejoin their country's army. Realizing that the city had been relieved, the Allies abandoned any plans for a further siege and instead moved southwards in the hope of trapping Rupert once he moved south himself. Athin, with the city relieved, argued that there was no need whatever to rush into a battle immediately. Both of the Royalist armies were exhausted, and it would be much better to rest them for a few days before moving out to fight the Allies. On the other hand, Rupert still had the king's letter summoning him urgently to that rendezvous at Worcester.
Rupert carried the letter that Charles had written him on his person to his dying day. He constantly sought to try and vindicate his actions at Marston Moor, and he used that letter as the means by which to try and do so.
There was no alternative, he argued, but to fight and to fight now. Reluctantly, Newcastle and Athin bowed to his wishes.
Whether or not Ethan was right in wanting to rest the York garrison before making a sally out to fight on Marston Moor is one of the great debates of this campaign. They in fact proved their ability by doing exactly what Rupert wanted. Although they arrived, according to Rupert, drunk and in a truculent mood, they fought very well. So consequently one is tempted to ask, well, would they have fought any better, or could they have fought any better had they been rested? Personally, I doubt it.
By the time Rupert's troops arrived in and around York, they had undergone a long march. They were clearly tired and therefore may have needed time to rest and recuperate. Had Rupert delayed giving battle, he could also have better welded his troops with the new reinforcements, the foot of Newcastle, that he picked up in York, instead of what actually happened, the rather messy arrangement that occurred on the 2nd of July.
What Prince Rupert could not know, however, was that just 3 days earlier, the king had actually defeated the army of Sir William Waller at Cropreedy Bridge. The pressure was relieved, and he no longer needed Rupert's assistance in the south. With the primitive communications of the day, Rupert could not know of this good news. Still thinking that he had to move fast, he set off in pursuit of the retreating allies early next morning, and he soon caught up with their rearguard on Marston Moor.
We're now up on Cromwell's Plump, or Cromwell's Clump, depending on which sources you look at, and this is where supposedly the parliamentary command met and controlled the battle. Marston Moor was initially an ideal battlefield, especially as far as the Parliamentarians were concerned. This line of hills stretches like a giant bar right across the Great Yorkshire Plain, and from up here you could actually see the Royalist army coming out of York to attack. And in order to defend their rear, this was the position that they could have only dreamed for. Now, to counter that, Rupert had to use the open moorland in front of us. From here, you can actually see the high ground, and you can begin to appreciate just why Prince Rupert wasn't anxious to attack, why he chose to make this a defensive battle. To attack that ridge with an inferior force would have been virtually to commit suicide. He had to fight a defensive battle down here on the flat, and to get Parliament to come off that ridge down here to fight him.
The cavalry regiments making up the Parliamentarian rearguard were positioned on a low ridge stretching from east to west, overlooking Marston Moor. But there was still no sign of the Roundhead infantry. The fiery Prince Rupert would certainly have attacked before the Allied foot returned if he had been given a chance. But the operation was already beginning to go badly wrong for Rupert. Although Rupert's cavalry had reached York the previous night, and so had only a short distance to march onto the moor, his infantry was still camped some miles back up the road at Tollerton, and had not even reached York as yet. As a result, it was some hours before they reached the battlefield. By the same token, there was no sign at all of the white-coated infantrymen belonging to Newcastle's army.
We know that the Royalists had problems in deploying on the 2nd of July. Rupert's men deployed on the battlefield quite early in the day, in the morning and the early afternoon, but then he was kept waiting. He was waiting for Newcastle's infantry to come out of York, and there were problems there.
Had Newcastle's men been here, he might have launched a full-scale assault on this ridge, and actually then have been in a position to use the reverse slopes on the Tadcaster side as a defensive battle. The whole battle would have shifted over one valley, and whether or not Parliament would have attacked him rather than continue their fall back, once again, We don't know.
There's a fair amount of room for conjecture when we consider how the armies were drawn up on Marston Moor. Prince Rupert was having a terrible job in bringing together the garrison of York and getting them onto the field. At the same time, the Parliamentarian forces were still in the process of turning themselves around and marching back onto the battlefield. So it's possible that the armies drew up almost as they came onto the field.
The delay had given the Roundheads the time they needed to regroup the three armies, and now they could count on a single force, 7,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry. On the left were the Eastern Association cavalry, led by one Oliver Cromwell, a lesser-known MP, but a gifted commander. Behind Cromwell's men were a brigade of cavalry under a professional soldier named David Leslie. These soldiers were destined to play a crucial role in the battle. In the centre stood the combined Allied infantry of the two armies, commanded by two more Scots professionals, Lawrence Crawford and Sir James Lumsden. On the right wing was Fairfax's cavalry and another Scots brigade. The Royalist dispositions left much to be desired. Rupert had intended that Newcastle's and his own should be drawn up side by side. However, the late appearance of the northern infantry meant that his own men had to be spread thinly across the front, while the latecomers eventually grouped together at the rear.
Working from the Parliament right to left, you have Sir Thomas Fairfax with cavalry against Goring with cavalry. You have in the centre Bailey and Crawford and Fairfax against Mackworth and Ethin with foot. And over on the extreme left you have Cromwell and Leslie against Byron, once again with cavalry. The classic foot in the centre, wings of horse formation.
Rupert assumed that it was too late in the day to fight. The battle would be fought on the morrow. But the Earl of Leven had other ideas.
In the case of the Marquess of Newcastle's troops, they would probably have been in better shape had they had the benefit of a night's rest. Rupert's troops had been up since 4 o'clock in the morning, and so they were rather weary by the end of the afternoon. But I think it should be noted that they didn't have the option of choosing when to strike the first blow. It was the parliamentary forces who decided, quite remarkably, at 7 o'clock in the evening to begin the battle.
They're taking a gamble themselves, both armies are tired, but they have got the superior numbers, and the other army is already beginning to ease off.
You could call Marston Moor a showcase for a lot of the types of combat that one saw in battle in the English Civil War, as distinct from in siege and in raids. And in battle, one of the things we see at Marston Moor is action of light field guns against cavalry and against infantry.
There had been an artillery duel before the battle proper started. There were about 24 guns on each side, but they made very little impact on the outcome.
The Allied army rolled down off the ridge and crossed the moor at a running march to attack the unsuspecting Royalists. On the left, Cromwell's men crashed into Lord Byron's Cavaliers. Almost at once, Byron gave way. But then Cromwell was countercharged by the Royalist second line, led by Prince Rupert himself. Undaunted, David Leslie brought up his brigade of lancers, and with the enthusiastic support of some Parliamentarian infantry, commanded by another Scots mercenary named Lawrence Crawford, he sent Rupert's Cavaliers fleeing backwards towards York. As if to compensate for this reverse, however, on the other flank, disaster had struck the Roundheads. As Sir Thomas Fairfax led his cavalry forward across the ditch, he ran into a storm of musketry and was then charged by two Royalist cavalry brigades under Lord Goring and the grim Sir Marmaduke Langdale.
Rupert had stationed Goring over on his left and had cleverly made use of the terrain features. In order to get at him, Fairfax had to get through hedges, ditches and essentially up a narrow lane. By using commanded muskets, those are bodies of musketeers spread amongst the cavalry, they were able to shoot the Parliamentary cavalry before they got in. Consequently, once the cavalry arrived in front of Goring, they were broken, they were disorganised, they were disordered. And then Goring was able to charge into them and, in fact, to rout them. And he pursued through the hedges, through the ditches, and into the plain beyond.
It could be said that Lord Goring's cavalry almost won the battle for the Royalists. It was successful in driving off the Fairfax's cavalry on the Parliamentarian right, and this then brought them in on the flank of the Scottish infantry, who were in the centre of the Royalist line.
On the field itself, you get this kind of big swing. On one side, the Royalists are victorious, and on the other side, the Parliamentarians. So the whole battlefield begins to pivot.
Encouraged by the success of Langdale, Sir Charles Lucas then charged forward at the head of the Royalist reserves. The undefended flank of the Allied infantry had been exposed by the flight of Fairfax's men, and Lucas, with his fresh cavalry, carved deep into it. Regiment after regiment of Scots infantrymen took to its heels and ran.
The Scottish forces who were supporting Sir Thomas Fairfax's cavalry didn't really have much of a chance because the English cavalry in front of them broke and ran through them and scattered and disorganised them and told them that the game was lost and so forth. So you can't quite blame the Scots cavalry there for retreating. The Scottish infantry fought quite solidly for quite some time before the impact of Newcastle's infantry, together with some of the Royalist cavalry upon them, told.
Cromwell in particular was very dismissive of the role of the Scots armies at Marston Moor. There's a fair amount of historical evidence to support at least that in part, because without a doubt some of the senior Scottish commanders fled the field and turned up 30 miles away thinking that Parliament had lost. So you can understand some of Cromwell's attitude.
Despite the flight of many of the Scots regiments, two Scots units, standing on the extreme right of the Allied front line, formed a hedgehog of pikes against the cavalry and stood like a rock, giving a trio of Scots officers the chance to turn the tide. First, Lieutenant General William Bailey rallied the four regiments in the crumbling centre, and as the Cavalier assault broke upon the resolute schiltrons of pikemen, the crisis was averted almost as quickly as it had arisen. At much the same time, Cromwell judged it safe to rejoin David Leslie in a renewed attack upon the Royalists' right flank. Sir Thomas Tildesley struggled vainly to hold them as the combined Allied cavalry and infantry destroyed his Royalist regiment. Prince Rupert himself had been ignominiously chased into a bean field by the victorious Allied cavalry, and in his absence, with ammunition running low, a general retreat began. So far, Newcastle's white-coated infantry had played no real part in the battle. But now, when they tried to withdraw eastward in good order, they found their line of retreat blocked by the Atterwyth enclosures.
The Atterwyth enclosures is really a grand name for what were probably a series of hedges or at best stone walls that were used for agricultural purposes. And it was this structure that the White Coats fell back into in the tail end of the battle, and it was here that they made their famous last stand.
As the Allies closed in, they turned at bay behind the ditches and hedges, and a fierce fight of renewed intensity began.
The infantry of the Marquis of Newcastle partly undid some of the disproportionate disadvantage that Rupert had in infantry. He was heavily outnumbered in infantry, and thus they play a part in evening up the balance and enabling the Royalist centre, the infantry, to hold the parliamentary infantry, and indeed for a time almost to gain the upper hand in that infantry fight in the centre of the battlefield.
Near Long Marston, Lord Goring had gathered up his victorious Cavaliers and was forming them up for another charge. A heavy Royalist counter-attack now could have devastating consequences. Realising the danger, David Leslie had now taken command of all the horse on the left wing, and he sent Oliver Cromwell to deal with Goring, while he and his Scots took on the stubborn Whitecoats.
I believe Newcastle's famous Whitecoats, rather than a last stand, which perhaps the Victorian writers owes more to Custer than to any English Civil War battlefield, is that you had a dogged fighting retreat, stopping at every hedgerow, every ditch to fire back, and that instead of dying to a man heroically grouped around a flag, they actually did fight a very clever and very hard fought withdraw slowly back into York.
The long day was drawing on, but Cromwell had still time enough to see off Goring's remaining Cavaliers. Cromwell was able to control his men after the charge, after they had broken the enemy, halt them, dispatch troops to pursue the enemy, and he was then able to wheel with a body still intact and attack the infantry, which, of course, gave enormous weight to the infantry battle.
And what happens, of course, is that the Parliamentarians are much more effective at rallying their troops, and they're able to bring their men down and redress the balance. And it's that constant ability to rally cavalry and bring them back round that helps Cromwell to emerge victorious.
As Fairfax rode round to Cromwell, Cromwell was able to intervene with intact cavalry. Cromwell more or less saved the day at Marston Moor, as he was later to do at Naseby. By now, the Royalists must have already known that the battle was lost, and in the ensuing melee, they were routed just as swiftly and decisively as Fairfax was.
The Battle of Marston Moor, like most of the key engagements in the Civil War, was ultimately determined, I believe, by the size of the armies. Almost always in a Civil War battle, the numerically superior army beats the numerically inferior army. And despite all the vicissitudes that we see in the course of the battle, in the 2 or 3 hours of that summer evening, eventually I think that told. That was the key point.
Marston Moor was an utter disaster for the king. The Royalists are now known to have lost no fewer than 10 colonels and at least 23 captains.
It is also the loss of 4,000 men killed, 1,500 captured. It's the loss of arms and ammunition, 10,000 stands of arms taken here. It's the loss of 25 guns taken here, the loss of the wagons, the whole plethora of war, the whole impedimenta had gone, the supply had gone.
Weary and dispirited, Rupert led the survivors of his broken army north to Richmond, and then back across the Pennines to rejoin the king.
After his defeat, Rupert could hardly scrape together 6,000 men. That's about a third of the army he'd commanded the day before, and he was forced to march away from York, leaving a much depleted garrison to try and hold the city.
York found itself besieged again and obviously didn't have the legs to undergo another siege. And effectively the whole of the north was lost to the king. It was a disastrous campaign in that respect.
The Marquis of Newcastle, who was the man who held Royalist forces together really in the north, was so depressed by the outcome that he took boat for the continent and didn't in fact return to England until the Restoration in 1660. So Charles lost his most effective man, his most loyal subject, his most loyal, wealthy subject in the north.
The real spin-off from Marston Moor was the freeing up of the Parliamentarian armies, the loss of the northern stronghold when York surrendered later, and the loss of the northern Royalist army meant that the Scots under Leven were free to go down into the Midlands, and that with Manchester, with Fairfax, they were able, because they were no longer engaged in serious fighting, they could now become the core that was a famous new model. The new model, it could be said, was born in blood on the fields behind me.
The Civil War dragged on for 2 more years. But for the king, the end was now inevitable. The bloody Battle of Marston Moor had been the first major step on that bitter road to surrender.
Marston Moor wasn't decisive in terms of deciding the outcome of the Civil War, but it certainly was decisive in terms of the war in the north. And once the king had lost the war in the north, it was only a matter of time before he would lose the war as a whole.